Today we're going to I've picked the topic of life among the mystics because I think mysticism sort of is like the umbrella for a lot of experiences. I mean, there's classic Christian mysticism, which we'll just touch on a bit today, but also the paranormal experiences that are involved with mystical experiences, and some of the more modern, some people that you will be more familiar with who've had mystical experiences. But the big question is, what is a mystical experience? Well, a near-death experience qualifies as a mystical experience. During near-death experiences, when people are having the out-of-body experience and going to wherever they go or whatever happens, to another realm, another dimension, I don't know, or some otherness, they're sort of reaching out and having a classical mystical experience, and we'll explain that a little bit more as we go through. But so I've just got here an explanation of mystical experiences. This is from the ancient Hindu tradition, and it says, imagine that you are in a completely dark room. You've been told that in this room lives a very large snake. As you sit in the room, you can see its silhouette and you feel great fear as you contemplate the potential for it to bite you at any moment. But one day there's a flash of light which illuminates the room, and you see that what looked like a snake is in reality a rope. And although the flash of light was momentary, it gave you a glimpse of the truth. And all of a sudden your long-held fear vanished entirely, and your experience in the room was never the same again. And this is what a mystical experience feels like. It's like a flash of truth that releases you from your limited sense of self and gives you a taste of reality that somehow feels more real. And that's what people who have near-death experiences report. You know, you might have read cases where they always say, what I experienced over there in the afterlife, or wherever it was that they went, it was more real for me than what it is here in this ordinary reality. And that's something that is impressed upon them and stays with them for forever, basically. You know, people who report near-death experiences and being in the afterlife, let's just call it that today, the afterlife, they're talking about, you know, that when they leave their body and they go there, anything to do with this world is just left behind, including their own bodies, any emotional connection to it, to the problems that they have, to the relationships they have with families, to their own physical body. They're just completely separate, and they have a better understanding of life in general in this other realm. Okay, or their existence, I should say, in this other realm. It's clearer to them without all these, how can I say it, the fetters of their lives, put it that way. Some of you have read the Bible at some stage, I'm sure, and heard various things, made to go to Sunday school like I was. So we have the story of St. Paul on the road to Damascus, and where he saw I can't remember whether it was a being or a being of light, I can't quite remember now, but he was struck by this light, and he fell to his knees and he became blind for 3 days, I think it was, before his vision eventually returned. And what happened was, it changed his whole perception. That experience, whatever perception he had before, his perception of what was going on at the time changed, like it was immediate. And there are other cases like that as well. So somehow the experience did something which we can't explain to change him. And the change is brought about by a lack of information gathered by the senses. It's like our inner knowing. You know, when you know something, you just know it. You're gathering, you just know stuff, you get information somehow, but and you can't explain how because you're not getting information from your senses. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of the Christian mystics. Saint Teresa of Avila, who's fairly well known, she was a Spanish mystic and a Roman Catholic saint and a Carmelite nun, and she wrote various books about after she had her experience and had others as well. And in her book, The Way of Perfection, she describes her prayer of the quiet, which resulted in mystical consciousness for her. And she says, "The soul rests in peace. All her powers are at rest," her meaning her soul. "The soul understands with an understanding quite different from that given by external senses," which is exactly what we were talking about. "That she is now quite close to God, and that if she drew just a little nearer, she would become one thing with him by union. She does not see him with eyes of the body or the soul. The soul understands he is there." So she's talking about a knowing that comes from, not her senses, right? Not information coming into her senses. "It's like the suspension of all internal and external powers. The soul is so happy to find herself near the fountain that she is satisfied even without drinking. She seems to have no more desire. The faculties are at peace and do not wish to move. However, the faculties are not so lost that they cannot think of him who they are near." And that, in a way, it describes people's experiences when they have a near-death experience. They have these experiences. They can gain information. They can often say, when I'm in that place or that state, I know how the universe works. I know so many other things that I don't know in this reality. But when I come back to this reality, I can't access it, right? So somehow they which I guess is a good example of how we can access a whole lot of information in altered states of consciousness that we can't access in ordinary consciousness. Carolyn Mace, I should say. A lot of you know about her. Is that good or bad? I don't know.
Yeah, wonderful.
Oh, yeah. Well, you can say, no, I can't help.
She's here at the moment, isn't she?
Yeah. I've studied a lot of her work over the years. I've got all her books. The first one was with Norm Shealy, which was the medical intuition or something, with her, I can't remember what the name of it was. But anyway, she says, mysticism is an inner knowing. The experience of coming to the truth is a mystical experience. And I guess that sort of indicates, if you unpack that, is that while we're living and having our ordinary lives, and I'm not saying any of you aren't extraordinary, but I'm just saying, our daily lives, that we're living with less than what is real. And I think a lot of us know that. We all know that we feel and sense that there is much more to our existence and to this reality than what we think. And she goes on to say, I was listening to a podcast of hers, she was saying that mystical experiences can be like the Christian mystics that have these amazing experiences, like St. Paul on the road to Damascus, right down to the simple experience of knowing something, but from an inner knowing. That is, because what are you tapping into when you're tapping into that knowledge from your inner knowing? Where is that coming from? And it's always right. It's all you just know, and you don't know how you know, you just know it. So that is a connection to something. But what is it? So we've got Rumi, who has written some beautiful poetry over the years that I've read. He was a Persian poet, a theologian and a Sufi mystic. And he describes his experience, or mystical experiences, and he says, whilst you regard the form, you are seeing double. Look not at the eyes, but at the light which flows from them. And I think this goes to a lot of mystics and people who have near-death experiences and other types of experiences, peak experiences, let's call it that. They talk about having a non-dual consciousness, Like at the moment we have a dual consciousness. We are aware of ourselves and we're aware of others. But when people have these experiences, this oneness floods in, and they become aware of they are a part of everything, right? So that dual consciousness fades away and becomes one. He says, you cannot distinguish the lights of 10 lamps burning together so long as your face is set towards this light alone. In things spiritual there is no partition, no number, no individuals. How sweet is the oneness of the friend with his friends. Catch the spirit and clasp it to your bosom. Mortify rebellious form till it wastes away. Unearth the treasure of unity. And I think when we have that sense of unity, a whole lot of other things happen. We can have access to information or knowledge, that internal knowledge that comes from something else. But miracles can occur then too. You know, people can have miraculous healings as well. When cases people have been given up on, their health has been given up on. Paramahansa Yogananda, Indian yogi and guru, as you know, introduced millions of people in the West to the teachings of meditation and yoga. And he describes his experience as cosmic consciousness. And there are many names for these types of things. And he says, an oceanic joy broke upon calm, endless shores of my soul. The Spirit of God, I realise, is exhaustless bliss. His body is countless tissues of light. A swelling glory within me began to envelop towns and continents, the earth, solar and stellar systems, tenuous nebula and floating universes. The entire cosmos, gently luminous, like a city seen afar at night, glimmered within the infinitude of my being. The sharply etched global outlines faded somewhat at the farthest edges, and there I could see a mellow radiance ever undiminished. It was indescribably subtle. The planetary pictures were formed of a grosser light. And he talks about intuitive perception. So there's that sense of expansion and becoming one with everything for Rumi. But let's have a look at someone that you're more familiar with. A 1987 survey by the National Opinion Research Centre reported that 43% of adult Americans said that they had had some type of mystical experience. Now that gets me wondering how much of this is normal for us. If that many people think that they have had some type of experience like that, what's happening with the other 57% for a start, which is the first thing I thought, well, why aren't they having it then? But that's a hell of a lot of people in the American population. Another study, this is a bit older, 78 and 79, reported that the Journal of Scientific Study of Religion reported that 56% of churchgoers said they had had such experiences. And I would expect that churchgoers there would be a higher number of people in that demographic. William James, psychologist and philosopher, described the simplest form of mystical experiences as an aha moment. How many of you had that? Like, aha! You're like, aha! It's sort of like, I get it, isn't it? Or, it's come to me. But where did it come from? What happened in my brain for the light to go on, basically? And how did it happen so fast? That's the other thing. You can thank Dr. Richard Maurice Buck for the cosmic consciousness term in our Western spirituality. But it's called various things in different traditions: nirvana, samadhi, Tao, and transcendental meditation. They call it pure consciousness and enlightenment, illumination, God realization. And the Christians refer to it as kingdom of God, grace and the Holy Spirit. Freud described it as an oceanic feeling, and the Quakers talk about that inner light. Types of mystical experience. Some of them can leave people feeling at one with all of nature. Others feel the oneness of his or her soul, which we were talking about before. a union with a personal God. I know in near-death experiences some people feel that they have this union with whoever it is, Jesus Christ for some people, Buddha for others. And different people look at mystical experiences in different ways. So some will look outward at the world to understand the divine, and others will look inward at the self to find the divine. And that last one is the most common across cultural divides. That most people will look within themselves to find that divine connection. But you have with the other one where they look outward. That's where you have a lot of Eastern traditions do that. They will look at, just look at their fantastic temples that they have. They're looking outwards. And I guess you can refer to mystical experiences as that narrow gate experience they talk about in the Bible, where they talk, what is the scripture? The path is wide but the gate is narrow. And going through that narrow gate, I think when you go back and have a look at that, it's about, they talk about the narrow gate to heaven actually, but what is it really? What is heaven? Is it just the truer reality, the greater reality? I don't really know. It just depends how you look at these things, doesn't it? But we're really talking about the light in the darkness here when we talk about mystical experiences. And I really like this one because it gives an idea of, does anyone know when that was done? It's a very common sketch that often people will use to describe breaking out of the reality that we exist in. But the characteristics of the mystical experience have that oneness connection, that conscious unity, transcendence of time and space. I know with people who've had near-death experiences will describe that there is no time where they are. Okay. Feelings of connecting with the divine, feelings of bliss, of gratitude and awe. The experience is fleeting, it doesn't last. It's really hard to stay in that space. I mean, you imagine if you were, if you were in that space and stayed there for a long, long time. I think it's impossible for our human brain and mind to be able to do that because there is so much there that we connect to that it's hard I think it's just too much for the brain and the mind to process. So these experiences are often fleeting rather than lasting. Not the effects of them, the after effects, but the experience itself. Like a near-death experience, I've never heard of one there was one. There was that guy, George Rodenier, who was pronounced dead, but was put in the morgue for 3 days, but he actually came back to life. When they started, I've told you that story where they started doing the autopsy on him, yeah, and his eyes started to flash. Ah! I'm alive! That's the longest that I've heard of, right? But that was a very prolonged near-death experience. But generally they're quite fleeting. They create lasting and transformative change. There's an inability to capture an experience in ordinary language, and people who have near-death experiences often say that I can't describe it. There were colours there that I saw that I cannot describe to you. That I have no words for it. Or the sounds of angels singing, I have no words for that, just cannot describe it. Has a noetic quality, the notion that mystical experiences reveal an otherwise hidden or inaccessible knowledge. And that's what we were talking about before. There's information there, but just can't keep it all. Psychic phenomena, ESP, out-of-body experiences, visions, prophetic voices, often associated, but not always, associated with the experience. And we'll go on to some of that. So that's where we come on to mysticism and the paranormal. I think a lot of not a lot, but there's certainly a percentage of paranormal experiences that I've read about that could be explained as mystical. Because a lot of paranormal events happen as a consequence of that type of experience. Well, this is one of them. Some of the Christian mystics are reported as having halos around their heads, and we know that that's pretty common. I'm not going to go into that, we all know that. Stigmata. So St. Francis of Assisi, that happened to him. So he was looking at he had taken himself off away from his mates, basically, into the forest, and he knelt down on his knees and basically asked for God to guide him or give him something. I can't quite remember now, but he was struck by these streams of light that came down into his hands, and from then on he developed stigmata. Now, what the heck is that? I have no idea, but it's definitely what I would call paranormal, supernatural. Was it aliens? I don't know, but what would be the point? There's also levitation can happen. So Simon Magus was 1st century AD, and he was giving information to the ruler at the time. I can't remember, King something, I can't remember who. And to prove that he was who he had the experience that he said he'd had, and he levitated, and he did it consciously, okay, to show that the king that what the information that was coming to him was of a divine nature, basically. Anyway, so he levitated, and St. Peter at the time was against these mystics, these Christian mystics, and he prayed against him to bring him down to the ground, which he did. Of course, before this, the people around were going, wow, that's amazing. And Peter goes and he prays and he brings him down to the ground. And poor Simon to death because he levitated. Ridiculous, but that's what happened. But it's a good example of levitation and some of the paranormal experiences that happen when people after people have mystical experiences and during them. How do you explain levitation? I don't really know, but I have read of yogis who can levitate. I've sort of kept that in my skeptical basket because I'd have to see these things for myself. Bilocation. Padre Pio bilocated. He also had stigmata. I had a brief bilocation experience when I was doing a workshop on Mount Tambourine many years ago when I was very ill, but I was also having a lot of paranormal things going on with me at the time. And I think I've told this to some of you might remember, but where there were about a dozen of us sitting around in a circle like here. We were, how can I say it? We had somehow dropped into a collective pond of energy, if I could say it that way. And the workshop leader, who was quite an advanced teacher, she said, this was on the Sunday, we'd already done one day together, and we did a whole lot of weird stuff. I'm talking weird. It was quite an advanced class. And what happened was she chastised us. She said, there it is, you finally connected. It took you long enough, right? This is what she's saying to us. She meant it kindly, of course, in a teacher way, but in a kind teacher way. And we dropped in, and we were all sitting there in a timeless space. And the energy was palpable. You could have cut it with a knife. And we're all just sitting there and we're looking around at each other like this. And she's talking and she's saying, so now you understand what it's like to be in the void. Actually, she was saying it much more calmly than that. Just so not to disturb our altered states of consciousness, because that's what happened. We'd all entered into that together at the same time and somehow connected. And anyway, during that, I left my body and went outside, and I touched down on the grass and I could feel the grass
under my feet, which was very strange. And I was aware of being outside, and but I was aware of being in the room at the same time. Now, I don't know if that was a bilocation, but my consciousness split, put it that way. And I would have liked it if there'd been someone outside who could have said, Sheryl, what are you doing here under the tree? I mean, I would have liked to have known that, but there was no, we were all inside, right? So, but it was certainly aware of being in two places at once, put it that way. And that's not unusual. I mean, I think we can do those sorts of, we can all have those things. I never thought for that to happen. It was just a spontaneous experience. So there's also telepathy and clairvoyance, materializations, odours of sanctity. Now this is what Giorgio had as well. Oftentimes when people have mystical experiences, you can also smell floral odours or unusual odours. Yes, so you can have those floral odours or smells of like oils, or even, which is interesting because my scientific mind, I'm not a scientist, but my left brain is saying, okay, how does that happen? And why does it happen? What's the mechanics in that? What makes that happen? Why? How can odour come from nothing, right? And I'm wondering, because I know with people who report close encounters with extraterrestrials, or some of them, they report a smell of sulphur, right, in the abduction type experiences, some of those people. But that's not what these fragrances are, but I'm wondering, is it to do with coming from another dimension? The manifestation of that, of something coming through, like the physics, you know, right, cutting through. So Native American mysticism is a bit different. I just thought I'd throw this in in Western mysticism, there is an experience of being in another realm, and you have to excuse me for sort of thinking some of these things through as I'm talking to you, because it's a big subject and you can't always find the words to talk about some things, right? I mean, how do you talk about a mystical experience, or how do you talk about mysticism? And I want to know the physics of mysticism. This is what I'm talking about, Tim. I want to know how these things happen. You know, my I'm not even going to say belief. My considered thought is that underlying everything there is physics to cosmic consciousness. Native American mysticism is a bit different in that there are layers to it, okay? And I'll just try and sort of... So the Native American, well, all shamans, but Native Americans, let's just stick to them, their cosmology is depicted by the world tree. So they have the lower world, the middle world, and the upper world. And if you can't see down the back there, there's a seahorse and fish and snake, dolphin, and looks like, I don't know what that is, starfish and all sorts of things. So the lower world is where all the power animals are. The middle world is the world of humanity, which animals share with us. And the upper world is, you know, the heavens, the astral planes, where the extraterrestrials hang out, the angels, the archangels, and all those types of things. So their mysticism is a bit different, and they're not the only ones. Now, in some Native Americans talk about the power of the universe, which is the binding force which holds everything together. But really, we might talk about it as the World Wide Web of consciousness, or something like that, or could even be cosmic consciousness, which was quantum consciousness you like to use. Yeah. The Sioux, the black elk and the reindeer referred to as Wakanda. And I've actually heard that in a documentary now I think about it. The Iroquois talk about Orenda, and Algonquin talk about the Manitou. So it's all about this energy, this ocean of energy that we can tap into, that has, because energy has in it information embedded in it. Okay. Any type of energy, like If you're ringing a bell, it has a certain sound, and the sound equates to a certain colour, and the colour could equate to a certain olfactory smell. Tim? Yeah. Etc., etc. So they have their vision quests and sweat lodges, which I would never want to go in a sweat lodge. I don't like perspiring. But Hawaiian mysticism, it has 4 levels. So I'm just showing you this how mysticism can be seen from many different perspectives, okay? And so the first one is the objective world, where it's the scientific material knowing, you know stuff from information, see, touch, feel. The subjective world, everything is connected, it's an emotional knowing. Then you've got the symbolic world, which it's all symbolic, it's a dream knowing. I was just talking about, I did an interview last week with someone, and I was talking about how we're making a new dreaming now about life in the universe, how through the study of exoplanets, that the new scientific research involving exoplanets, where we're discovering that there are many worlds out there where life can exist that are very much like Earth. So we're creating a new dreaming beyond Earth now, that our dreaming is we're part of a bigger village, I guess you could call it. We talk about Earth as a global village, now we've got a universal village. So we're creating a new dream. And then the holistic world where everything is one. And those UFO people who are here all know, and others too, know about Dr. Edgar Mitchell, and he actually started the Institute of Noetic Sciences after he had a mystical experience when he was out in space. And he happened to catch the view of the moon, the earth, was it the sun? The 3 of them at once through the porthole, and it had a profound effect on him. That alone in itself is very interesting, how we can look at something and it has an effect on us. Edgar Mitchell described his mystical experience working on the moon's surface for 9 hours apparently. He was on his way back to Earth. And he says, I had completed my major task for going to the moon and was on my way home and was observing the heavens and the earth from this distance. Observing the passing of the heavens, as we were rotated, I saw the earth, the sun, the moon, and a 360-degree panorama of the heavens. The magnificence of all of this was this trigger to my visioning. In the ancient Sanskrit, it's called samadhi. It means that you see things with your senses the way they are. You experience them viscerally and internally as a unity and a oneness accompanied by ecstasy. All matter in our universe is created in star systems, and so the matter in my body, the matter in the spacecraft, the matter in my partner's bodies was the product of stars. We are stardust, and we're all one in that sense. Must have been a hell of an experience. Wow. Amazing stuff. But he said, saw the truth, basically. Which goes back to what I was saying in the beginning, how we're not really living with true reality, we're living with an abstract of reality, aren't we? Created by our own brush on the canvas. Dr. Jane Goodall, still alive, British primatologist, anthropologist, and UN Messenger of Peace. She had an experience, and this is what she said. Lost in awe at the beauty around me, I must have slipped into a state of heightened awareness. It's hard, impossible really, to put into words the moment of truth that suddenly came upon me then. Even the mystics are unable to describe their brief flashes of spiritual ecstasy. It seemed to me, as I struggled afterward to recall the experience, the self was utterly absent. I and the chimpanzees, the earth and trees and air, seemed to merge, to become one with the spirit power of life itself. The air was filled with a feathered symphony, the even song of birds. I heard new frequencies in their music and also in singing insects' voices. Notes so high and sweet I was amazed. Never had I been so intensely aware of the shape, the colour of the individual leaves, the varied patterns of the veins that made each one unique. Scents were clear as well, easily identifiable, fermenting overripe fruit, waterlogged earth, cold wet bark, the damp odour of chimpanzee hair, and yes, my own too, and the aromatic scent of young crushed leaves was almost overpowering. That afternoon, it had been as though an unseen hand had drawn back a curtain, and for the briefest moment I had seen through such a window. In a flash of outsight, I had known timelessness and quiet ecstasy, sensed a truth of which mainstream science is merely a small fraction, and I knew that the revelation would be with me for the rest of my life, imperfectly remembered, yet always within. A source of strength on which I could draw when life seemed harsh or cruel or desperate. And Annie was asking me before about some of the experiences I've had, and one I've shared many times about having a near-death experience. I won't go into that now, but what changed for me was, before the experience, my life, I described it as a bowl of water that would slosh around and would move and it'd be churned up and there'd be currents in it and it'd always be doing this sort of thing. But after that experience, and for a very long time, and even to this day, but particularly directly after the experience, I describe that bowl now as being the still pool within. And I could almost, but not quite, almost sense that pool of water within me, that calming feeling. And for a long time, people would say to me how very calm they felt around me. And I don't know, that was just like a byproduct of the experience. But that sense of inner stillness stayed with me for a long time, like an effortless stillness. It's a very interesting experience. Evelyn Underhill. She was an English poet and a novelist and a writer on mysticism. She wrote a number of books on mysticism, including Mysticism, The Mystic Way, Practical Mysticism, and The Essentials of Mysticism. So this is an excerpt from her Letters of Evelyn Underhill, where she describes it. She says, "The first thing I found out was exalted, an indescribable beauty in the most squalid places. I still remember walking down the Notting Hill main road and observing the landscape, which was extremely sordid, with joy and astonishment. Even the movement of traffic had something universal and sublime about it. Of course, that does not last, but the after flavour of it does. And now and then one catches it again. When one does catch it, it's so real that to look upon it as wrong would be an unthinkable absurdity. At the same time, one sees the world at those moments so completely, as energised by the invisible, that there is no temptation to rest in mere enjoyment of the visible." In another passage, she talks about mystical consciousness, and she says in experience that all things are perceived in the light of charity, which is exactly what she was just describing then, wasn't it? That no matter how bad things appear to be, it's like a sense of that's the way it is and it's beautiful. So I guess it's sort of like, if you're applying it to yourself, it's like loving yourself warts and all. But it's like in a mystical sense, it's like loving all the warts all the time. Nancy Clark, she was a past president of, I think she was, of the Ohio branch of the International Association of Near-Death Studies. She had an experience. She worked as a cancer researcher, and she had devoted her life to spiritual work. And she says of her experience, which I find quite fascinating. A few days before her mystical experience, Clark, whose years prior had had a near-death experience during childbirth, she had a premonition in a dream of the death of a very close friend. Clark later learned that her premonition came true. On the same night of her dream, her close friend had died in a plane crash. So Clark gave a eulogy at her friend's service, stating that her mystical experience occurred simultaneously while she was delivering the eulogy. And she says, I was addressing the audience with the eulogy and I spoke perhaps 3 sentences when all of a sudden I became aware of a brilliant white light coming from the left rear of the chapel at the ceiling. I didn't see this light with my eyes, but rather with some other unexplainable source. It was more of an inner awareness. I find it very difficult to describe. I could see, but it was definitely not through my human eyes. Upon seeing this light, there was immediate recognition on my part that it was God. I felt I was in the presence of my Creator, a very exhilarating spiritual feeling. I can't explain how I knew or how I recognised God's presence. The best I can do is to say that there was a transference of knowledge placed directly into my consciousness. In other words, I was being fed the information that I was supposed to receive. The light completely surrounded me. I felt as if I had merged completely with the light and belonged to it. I felt a greater sense of reality and truth in this state, and I felt as if I was home. The love that was emanating from the light is by far the most difficult aspect of my experience to relate to others. I feel so inadequate to speak of this love, not because I'm not a scholar, a theologian, a scientist, or someone who can dissect it and analyse it. I'm limited simply by being human. It was not a human kind of love. It was not within the framework of our human experiences. Therefore, it defies human explanation. I can only say that it's because of this love that was channeled to me that I'm able to remain strong and travel down life's highway knowing that a great truth has occurred. I wanted to remain in the presence of this light forever. I felt as I was in a state of grace. All my sins were forgiven and I felt perfectly and totally free. If I had somehow been asked at that moment if I wanted to go with this light and leave my earthly life behind, I would not have hesitated and I would have chosen to go. Not because earthly life is so bad, but rather that's how incredibly beautiful the light was. It's an interesting experience, eh? So she had that information passed on to, knowledge passed on to her from something other than her own senses. Have anyone heard of Sadhguru? Science will tell you it's some sort of temporal lobe problem, obviously. Problem, or some sort of temporal lobe experience. It doesn't explain veridical information though. For example, in a near-death experience, when people die and they go to the other side and they meet, say, a sibling who's passed on before they were actually born, and they tell them information. And then they come back and they confirm it with their parents, right? They come back from the afterlife, confirm the information they were given with their parents. And they say, yeah, it's true, that actually happened. You know, you did have a brother or sister that we never told you about, we weren't going to bother, they died before you were born, blah, blah, blah. Temporal lobe events don't explain those types of things. So, I don't know, why do we have mystical experiences? I don't know. But we do, a lot of people do, from huge seeing God or Jesus or Buddha or someone to just that inner knowing. Just some thoughts about that though. We are an evolutionary species in an evolutionary world, and each and every one of these events could be to serve that higher function. Could it be that this is sort of like part of our biological evolution and our spiritual evolution? Because I don't think you can evolve spiritually, but you also need to evolve biologically, because these days you get a body for 90 years, right? So you've got to have the body congruent with the mind and vice versa. So that's why people have all these, go on healthy diets and do all sorts of things, cleanse, purge, whatever it is, to help them feel lighter and therefore more able to contain, let's say, higher energy, more refined energy maybe, I don't know, and vice versa. I don't know, I do think that mystical experiences have played a huge part in human history. They've probably defined it in many ways because of the spiritual and religious traditions that have grown up around the individuals who have the experiences. And if you look at the heart of all those teachings, there's always one individual who's had something extremely supernatural, paranormal, mystical happen to them. And then that tradition has grown around them. So it seems that truth ruptures illusions that reason tries to hold in place. So from time to time, individuals have these experiences where truth shines through with laser-like intention to this reality and our perception of it. And it breaks off all the bits and pieces, the mould and the rust that have sort of encased our perception. The human mind depends on a superior divine intellect which illuminates it and permits it to think. The soul reaches out to connect with the divine. That's a quote from a book that I'm reading called Mystics as a Force for Change by Silva, some Indian name. And I think that's a really interesting statement about the human mind depends on that divine intellect to, I guess, interact with it, to help us go beyond what we know now to other things where we have those inner knowings, where we have those mystical experiences that take us further than where we are. Would we evolve the way we have if we hadn't had that injection into human consciousness? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. I don't really know. How does it help us understand the afterlife? Well, I guess, I don't know. It's, can we understand the afterlife? But certainly some of this relates to near-death experiences and the types of things that happen to those people. We may never be able to understand and or articulate the afterlife and the experiences that people have in that state because it is a mystical experience and that's really hard to define.